The gunshot that rang through the quiet afternoon was the sound that brought Beatrice Evans into Jackson Montgomery's life, though he wouldn't know it until hours later when he found her crouched over a wounded fox, muttering strange words that no decent Christian in Greeley, Colorado had ever heard before. It was 1878, and Greeley was still young as frontier towns went, barely 7 years since its founding as a Union colony. The railroad had brought prosperity, farmers, and the usual assortment of saloons that followed men with money to spend. But it had also brought Beatrice Evans, and Greeley didn't quite know what to do with her. Jackson Montgomery had been riding fence along the eastern border of his modest cattle ranch when he heard the shot. Normally, a single gunshot wouldn't have warranted much attention men hunted. After all, but something about the way it echoed made him rein his horse around and follow the sound. When he crested the small ridge overlooking Fallen Creek, he saw her. She knelt beside the wounded red fox, her hands moving in the air above it, her lips forming words he couldn't hear. Her long chestnut hair had mostly escaped its pins and fell in waves down her back. She wore men's trousers, not the split skirt some practical women had taken to wearing, but actual men's denims with a woman's blouse and a leather vest. A small satchel lay open beside her, revealing glass vials of colored liquids and bundles of dried plants. Jackson approached slowly, keeping his hand near the Colt at his hip. "Madam, are you all right?" She turned, and Jackson was struck by eyes the color of summer sage. "This fox has been shot for sport," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "The poor creature was doing no harm. Most folks around here shoot predators on sight," Jackson said, dismounting. "They take chickens. This one wasn't near any farm," she countered, returning her attention to the fox. "And now he will die for someone's moment of amusement." As Jackson watched, she took a small vial from her satchel and poured its contents onto a cloth, then pressed it gently to the fox's wound. "There now," she murmured. "This will numb the pain while I work." "You a doctor?" Jackson asked, coming closer. She laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Not the kind your town would recognize." Jackson had heard rumors about the strange woman who had moved into Old Man Creedy's abandoned cabin at the edge of town 3 months ago. Some said she was a witch, others that she was simply touched in the head. All agreed she wasn't right. "You're Miss Evans," he said, not a question. "Beatrice," she confirmed without looking up. "And you're Jackson Montgomery, the cattle rancher with the Palomino stallion everyone covets." He raised an eyebrow. "We haven't met." "People talk," she said simply, now using a needle and thread to close the fox's wound with surprising skill. "They talk about you, and they certainly talk about me. They say you speak to animals," Jackson said, crouching down beside her, "that you mix potions and chant spells." Her hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "And what do you say, Mr. Montgomery?" "I haven't said anything yet," he replied honestly. "I like to make up my own mind about folks." A small smile touched her lips. "That makes you unusual in Greeley." The fox made a small sound but didn't struggle as she finished her stitching and applied a salve from another vial. "He'll live," she said with satisfaction, "though he may be wary of humans for some time to come." "Can't blame him for that," Jackson said. Beatrice gathered her supplies and stood, finally looking at him properly. She was tall for a woman, nearly reaching his shoulder, and her face was sun-kissed in a way that told him she spent more time outdoors than was fashionable for ladies. "They say you're a fair man," she said, studying him. "That you paid the Ute for the land you ranch instead of just taking it like most." Now it was Jackson's turn to be surprised. "That was private business." "Not to the Ute," she replied. "Chief Colorado speaks well of you, that's rare. You speak with the Ute?" Jackson asked, unable to hide his astonishment. Relations between whites and the native tribes were strained at best, especially with the tensions rising over in the White River Agency. I trade with them, my medicines for their knowledge of local plants. She closed her satchel. They think I'm mad too, if that makes you feel better. Despite himself, Jackson laughed. That does make me feel better, Miss Evans. She smiled, and something in Jackson's chest shifted slightly. I should get this fellow somewhere safe to recover, she said, gently scooping up the now drowsy fox. I can give you a ride back to your cabin, Jackson offered, gesturing to his horse. Thank you, but no, she said. I'm not going directly home, and Prometheus doesn't care for horses. Prometheus, she lifted the fox slightly. Every creature deserves a dignified name. Jackson watched her walk away, her stride confident and unhurried, the fox cradled against her chest like a precious burden. He stood there long after she disappeared into the trees, wondering what had just happened. 2 days later, Jackson found himself riding toward Beatrice Evans' cabin with the flimsiest of excuses. He'd convinced himself he merely wanted to check on the fox, a ridiculous notion even to his own ears. Her cabin sat in a small clearing, the log walls weathered but sound. A neat garden spread across one side, filled with plants Jackson didn't recognize, while chickens pecked contentedly in a fenced area. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and he caught the scent of something cooking that made his mouth water unexpectedly. Before he could call out, Beatrice emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. She didn't look surprised to see him. "Mr. Montgomery," she said by way of greeting. "Have you come to check on Prometheus, or to satisfy your curiosity about the town's madwoman?" "Both, I reckon," he admitted, dismounting. "And to bring this." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small package wrapped in butcher paper. "Venison, shot it yesterday." Something like amusement flickered in her eyes. "Trying to make up for Prometheus's shooter, just being neighborly," he said, though the truth was he wasn't entirely sure why he'd come. "How is the little fellow? Recovering well? Would you like to see him?" Jackson nodded, tethering his horse to a nearby post. He followed her inside the cabin, surprised by what he found. The interior was clean and orderly, with bunches of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and shelves lined with books and glass containers. A small bed occupied one corner, and a cooking area with a cast iron stove the other. The center held a table covered with more books and what appeared to be a partially dissected plant. "You read all these?" he asked, scanning the titles. Most were scientific in nature: botany, zoology, anatomy. "I do," she replied, setting the venison on a sideboard. "Education is a luxury not easily abandoned even in Greeley." In a box near the stove, lined with soft cloths, lay Prometheus. The fox lifted its head as they approached, ears perked with interest rather than fear. "He looks good," Jackson said, genuinely impressed. The animal's eyes were clear, and though it still moved gingerly, there was strength in its limbs. "He'll be ready to return to the wild in another week or so," Beatrice said, kneeling to stroke the fox's russet fur. "Though I suspect he'll visit from time to time. Animals remember kindness, unlike some people." Jackson sensed a story there but didn't press. Instead, he asked, "Where did you learn to treat animals like this?" "My father was a doctor in Boston," she replied, rising to check something simmering in a pot on the stove. "He wanted a son to follow in his footsteps, but got me instead. He taught me anyway, though he never expected me to use the knowledge. And your mother died when I was young. But before that, she taught me about plants and their uses. She was from the old country Hungary, where such knowledge was still passed down from mother to daughter." She stirred the pot. "The women there were often called witches too. Is that why you left Boston? Because people called you a witch?" Beatrice's expression darkened. I left because after my father died, his colleagues made it clear that a woman with my interests had no place in their world. One of them, a man who had once been my father's friend, offered to marry me and cure me of my unnatural fascinations. The way she said it made Jackson's jaw tighten. "So you came west?" "I went wherever the trains were going," she said with a small shrug. "I stopped in Greeley because the mountains reminded me of stories my mother told about her homeland. And now the town thinks you're crazy," Jackson said. "People fear what they don't understand," she replied. "It's easier to call someone mad than to question your own limited view of the world." "Not everyone in town thinks that way," Jackson said. "Mrs. Whitley at the general store speaks well of you. Says you gave her something for her arthritis that works better than doctor's medicine." "Willow bark and meadowsweet," Beatrice said. "Simple remedies, but effective. And old man Peterson claims you saved his best milk cow when the veterinarian from Fort Collins had given up." She smiled faintly. "The cow had eaten low-cowweed. I simply knew the antidote." "That's what I mean," Jackson said. "Seems to me you're the most sensible person in Greeley. You just know things others don't." Beatrice looked at him with genuine surprise. "That's not what most people conclude." "I'm not most people," he said with a slight smile. "No," she agreed, studying him with those sage green eyes. "I'm beginning to see that." Over the following weeks, Jackson found reasons to visit Beatrice's cabin with increasing frequency. Sometimes he brought game or fish. Other times he simply stopped by on his way to or from town. They talked about her work, his ranch, books they'd read, and the changing politics affecting Colorado since it had gained statehood 2 years prior. He learned that Beatrice had published scientific articles under her father's name before his death, that she corresponded with naturalists as far away as California and New York, that she'd been shunned by Boston society not just for her interest in medicine, but for her outspoken views on women's suffrage and her refusal to marry where her heart wasn't engaged. In turn, he told her about growing up on a failing farm in Missouri, about coming west after the war with nothing but determination, and the skills he'd learned breaking horses for the Union cavalry, about building his modest ranch from nothing, and his quiet but firm stance on treating the native tribes with respect, a position that had made him few friends among the more opportunistic settlers. It was during one such conversation, as summer was giving way to fall, that trouble found them. Jackson was helping Beatrice harvest herbs from her garden when Sheriff Dawson rode up, accompanied by 3 men from town: Elias Grant, the banker; Thomas Harper, who owned the largest mercantile; and Reverend Simmons, whose sermons had increasingly included references to witchcraft and ungodly women. "Montgomery," Sheriff Dawson nodded tersely, "didn't expect to find you here." Jackson straightened, unconsciously positioning himself between Beatrice and the men. "Sheriff, gentlemen, what brings you out this way?" Reverend Simmons spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of his pulpit. "We've come about a serious matter concerning Miss Evans and her practices." "What practices would those be, Reverend?" Beatrice asked, coming to stand beside Jackson. "Mrs. Peterson's youngest boy has taken ill," Grant said, his jowly face stern. "High fever, strange rash. Doc Hopkins can't make heads or tails of it." "I'm sorry to hear that," Beatrice said, "but I fail to see what that has to do with me." "The boy was fine until after he drank some concoction you gave his mother," Harper accused, pointing a thick finger at her. "Said it was for the child's cough." Jackson felt Beatrice stiffen beside him. "I gave Mrs. Peterson a simple syrup of honey and horehound," she said. "It's a common remedy for coughs. There's nothing in it that could cause fever or rash." "Unless it was tainted with something else," Reverend Simmons said darkly. Something ungodly. Now wait just a minute, Jackson began, but Sheriff Dawson raised a hand. We're not here to make accusations, the sheriff said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But folks in town are concerned. The boy's quite sick, and there's talk that, well, that Miss Evans might be practicing things beyond simple remedies. You mean witchcraft, Beatrice said flatly. Let's not mince words, Sheriff. We're simply asking you to come to town and explain the ingredients in your remedies, Grant said, to clear the air, as it were. Jackson didn't like the look in the banker's eyes. Seems to me Miss Evans just did explain. Honey and whorehound. Nothing devilish about that. Nevertheless, the sheriff said, it would be best if she came with us. For her own protection, if nothing else. There's a lot of angry talk in town. Talk you three have been stoking, Jackson said coldly. He'd heard rumors about Grant trying to buy the land Beatrice's cabin sat on land that had suddenly become more valuable with talk of a new spur line coming through. And Harper had been furious when his wife started buying Beatrice's remedies instead of the expensive patent medicines he stocked. I'll come, Beatrice said quietly, touching Jackson's arm. But not today. I need to harvest these herbs before the frost comes tonight, or a year's work will be wasted. The boy could die waiting, Reverend Simmons said ominously. The boy won't die of a rash and fever in the next few hours, Beatrice replied. But if you're so concerned, tell me his symptoms in detail, and I'll prepare something to help him. I can bring it to town tomorrow. The men exchanged glances. That would be acceptable, Sheriff Dawson said finally. But I'll expect you at my office by noon tomorrow, Miss Evans. After they'd described the boy's symptoms and ridden away, Beatrice sank onto a garden bench, her face pale. They're looking for an excuse, she said quietly. To do what? Jackson asked, though he feared he knew the answer. To run me off, or worse. She looked up at him. This isn't about the Peterson boy. Grant wants my land, and Harper resents that I'm taking business from him. And the Reverend, he disapproves of a woman living alone, making her own way, Beatrice said. Men like him need women to be dependent, or their whole view of the world crumbles. Jackson paced, thinking. What will you make for the boy? A poultice for the rash and a tea for the fever, she said. From his symptoms, it sounds like he got into poison ivy and then developed a secondary infection. Not uncommon for children playing in the woods this time of year. And not caused by your cough syrup, Jackson noted. Of course not. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. But that won't matter if they've decided I'm to blame. I'll ride with you tomorrow, Jackson said firmly. You won't face them alone. Beatrice gave him a long look. You're risking your standing in the community, associating with the town witch. I reckon my standing can withstand it, he said with more confidence than he felt. The truth was, his ranch was just beginning to turn a profit, and he relied on local goodwill for much of his business. But the thought of Beatrice facing those men alone made his blood run cold. She must have read something of his thoughts in his face, because her expression softened. Thank you, Jackson, but this isn't your fight. Seems to me it became my fight when those men rode onto your property making threats, he said. Besides, I've never been one to stand aside when something isn't right. Beatrice stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the herbs on her hands and the faint scent of lavender in her hair. You're a rare man, Jackson Montgomery. Before he could respond, she reached up and pressed a brief, soft kiss to his cheek, then turned and walked back to her garden, leaving him standing there, his heart thundering like a stampeding herd. The next day dawned clear and cool, autumn painting the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold. Jackson arrived at Beatrice's cabin early, finding her calmly packing her remedies for the Peterson boy into a basket. You don't seem worried, he observed. "I've faced worse than small-town prejudice," she replied, though the tightness around her eyes belied her casual tone. "Besides, once the boy improves with my treatment, they'll have no grounds for their accusations." "Unless they claim your cure is further evidence of witchcraft," Jackson said grimly. "That's how witch trials worked in the old days, damned if you did, damned if you didn't." Beatrice's hand stilled. "This isn't Salem, Jackson. It's 1878 in Colorado territory." "Colorado State now," he corrected automatically. "And people haven't changed as much as we'd like to think." They rode into town together, Jackson on his Palomino and Beatrice on a sturdy brown mare she'd purchased from a passing trader. Her hair was neatly pinned beneath a practical hat, and she wore a split riding skirt rather than her usual trousers, a concession to town sensibilities that Jackson suspected cost her. Greeley was busy that morning, the streets filled with wagons and townspeople going about their business. Heads turned as they passed, conversations halting mid-sentence. Jackson nodded to those he knew, his face betraying nothing of his inner tension. They stopped first at the Peterson farm on the edge of town. Mrs. Peterson, a tired-looking woman with work-roughened hands, met them at the door with undisguised relief. "Miss Evans, thank the Lord you've come," she said, ushering them inside. "Tommy's fever spiked in the night and the rash is spreading." "May I see him?" Beatrice asked. "All business now, Mrs." Peterson led them to a small bedroom where a boy of about 8 lay flushed and restless on a narrow bed. His face and arms were covered with an angry red rash, and his breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. Beatrice set her basket down and approached the child, speaking to him in a gentle voice as she examined the rash. "Hello, Tommy. I'm Miss Evans. I'm going to help you feel better." The boy blinked up at her through fever-glazed eyes. "Are you the witch lady?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jackson tensed, but Beatrice merely smiled. "Some people call me that," she said, "but I'm just a lady who knows about plants that can help people heal, like the syrup I made for your cough." "It tasted good," Tommy said, "like honey." "That's right. And these medicines will help with your fever and this itchy rash." She turned to Mrs. Peterson. "Has he been playing in the woods recently?" The woman nodded. "Last week, he and some friends were building a fort by the creek." "That explains it," Beatrice said. "It's poison ivy, with a fever that's come from scratching the rash and introducing infection." She began taking items from her basket. "I've brought a poultice to draw out the infection and reduce the swelling, and a tea that will bring down the fever. I've also made a salve that will stop the itching." As she worked, explaining each step to Mrs. Peterson, Jackson watched from the doorway. Beatrice's hands moved with sure, practiced efficiency, her manner professional yet warm. There was nothing mysterious or witch-like about her methods, just sound medical knowledge applied with care. By the time she finished, Tommy was already looking more comfortable, the angry red of his rash beginning to fade where the poultice had been applied. "He should start improving by this evening," Beatrice told Mrs. Peterson. "Continue with the tea every 4 hours and apply the salve whenever the itching returns. The poultice should be changed morning and night until the swelling is gone." Mrs. Peterson clutched Beatrice's hand. "Thank you. I don't care what they say about you in town, you've been nothing but kind to my family." "Did your husband tell the Reverend and others that my cough syrup made Tommy sick?" Beatrice asked quietly. The woman looked away. John was upset and confused. "The boy took sick so sudden, and Reverend Simmons was there when it happened." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "But I'll set the record straight. I'll tell them all it was poison ivy, plain as day." "I'd appreciate that," Beatrice said. They left the Peterson farm with a sense of cautious optimism. But as they approached the sheriff's office in the center of town, Jackson noticed a crowd had gathered. "This doesn't look good," he murmured, instinctively moving his horse closer to Beatrice's. "No," she agreed, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "It doesn't." The crowd parted as they dismounted and approached the sheriff's office. Jackson recognized most of the faces: shopkeepers, farmers, ranch hands, ordinary people he'd done business with for years. But today, their expressions ranged from curious to openly hostile. Sheriff Dawson stood on the steps with Reverend Simmons and Elias Grant. The banker's face darkened when he saw Jackson. "Miss Evans," the sheriff called, "I see you've decided to join us. And Mr. Montgomery, still involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. When decent folks are threatened for no good reason, it concerns all of us," Jackson replied evenly. "We're not threatening anyone," Reverend Simmons said, his voice carrying to the crowd. "We're simply seeking answers about the strange occurrences that have followed Miss Evans' arrival in our community." "What occurrences would those be, Reverend?" Beatrice asked, her chin high. "I've just come from the Peterson farm, where I treated Tommy for poison ivy and the infection that followed. His mother can confirm that's what ailed him, not my cough syrup." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Reverend's face tightened. "One explanation doesn't account for all the oddities. The animals that follow you, the lights seen at your cabin at all hours, the strange plants you grow that no one can identify." "I study nature, Reverend. That's hardly a crime." "It's unnatural for a woman to live as you do," Grant interjected. "Alone, without family or husband, conducting experiments like some kind of scientist," Beatrice suggested. "Because that's what I am. My father was Dr. Jonathan Evans of Boston. I assisted him in his practice for 10 years. Everything I do is based on medical science and botany, not witchcraft or devilry." Jackson stepped forward. "Miss Evans has helped dozens of people in and around Greeley with her knowledge. Mrs. Whitley's arthritis, Peterson's milk cow, the Clark baby's colic. If she were practicing dark arts, would her remedies heal?" "The devil often disguises his work as good," Reverend Simmons said darkly, "to lure the unwary." "That's mighty convenient reasoning, Reverend," Jackson said. "If she does harm, she's a witch. If she does good, she's still a witch." "This isn't about superstition," Grant snapped. "It's about the safety of our community. We can't have someone dispensing unknown substances to our citizens without proper credentials or oversight." "And what are your credentials to judge her, Grant?" Jackson demanded. "Last I checked, you were a banker, not a doctor or scientist." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Jackson could sense the momentum changing as people considered his words. Many of them had benefited from Beatrice's remedies, even if they'd been quiet about seeking her help. Sheriff Dawson seemed to sense it too. "Look, no one's accusing Miss Evans of anything official," he said, attempting to defuse the situation. "We just wanted to clear the air about the Peterson boy." "And I've done so," Beatrice said firmly. "I've left Mrs. Peterson with proper treatments, and the boy is already improving. Anyone who wishes to verify this can visit them." "That still doesn't address the larger concern," Reverend Simmons insisted. "A woman living alone, practicing medicine without license. Is that what this is really about, Reverend?" Beatrice interrupted. "Or is it that Mr. Grant wants my land for the railroad spur he's been secretly negotiating? Or that Mr. Harper resents that people prefer my herbal remedies to his overpriced patent medicines?" A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Grant's face flushed dark red. "That's a slanderous accusation." "Is it?" Jackson asked, seizing the moment. "Because I heard from Joe Wilson over at the land office that you've been asking about mineral rights all along that ridge where Miss Evans' property sits. And you, Harper, you raised the price on asafoetida by 50% after Mrs. Miller said Miss Evans' fennel tea worked better for her baby's colic. Harper spluttered indignantly, but the damage was done. People in the crowd were whispering now, connecting dots they hadn't before. "This meeting is over," Sheriff Dawson declared, clearly unhappy with how things had turned. "Miss Evans, you're free to go about your business, but I'd advise you to be more careful about what remedies you provide to folks and to make sure they understand exactly what they're taking." "I always do, Sheriff," Beatrice replied, "though I wonder if Mr. Harper extends the same courtesy with the patent medicines he sells, many of which contain morphine and alcohol without proper labeling." More murmurs from the crowd. Harper looked as if he might explode. "Come on," Jackson said quietly to Beatrice. "Let's go while we're ahead." They mounted their horses and rode slowly through the dispersing crowd. Some people nodded to them, others looked away. A few, like Mrs. Whitley, smiled openly or whispered words of support. They were nearly at the edge of town when Elias Grant came hurrying after them, his face still flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Evans," he called. "You can't stand against progress. That land of yours is going to be worth something when the railroad comes through, and you'd be wise to sell to me now while the offer's good." Jackson turned his horse. "Is that a threat, Grant?" "It's business, Montgomery. Something you might understand if you weren't so busy playing protector to the town witch." "Call her that again," Jackson said, his voice dangerously soft, "and we'll have a different kind of conversation." Grant faltered under Jackson's steady gaze. "You're making a mistake aligning yourself with her. People will remember." "Yes," Jackson agreed. "They will remember who stood for what's right and who tried to bully a woman off her land for profit." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mr. Grant." They rode in silence until they were well out of town, the tension gradually easing from Beatrice's shoulders as the distance grew. "That could have gone worse," she finally said. "It could have gone better too," Jackson replied grimly. "Grant won't give up easily, neither will the Reverend." "No." She looked over at him, her expression troubled. "You've put yourself in a difficult position for my sake." Jackson shrugged. "Wasn't much of a choice. Right is right. Still," she said softly, "not many would have done what you did. Standing against the most powerful men in town isn't good business." "There are more important things than business," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Besides, I meant what I said back there. You're the sanest person in Greeley, far as I'm concerned." A slow smile spread across her face, lighting her eyes in a way that made Jackson's heart skip. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." They reached a fork in the road, one path leading to Jackson's ranch, the other to Beatrice's cabin. "I should get back and check on things," Jackson said reluctantly. "Will you be all right?" "I've managed on my own for quite some time," she reminded him, but her tone was gentle. "But thank you for today, for everything." Jackson nodded, suddenly awkward. "I'll ride by tomorrow, make sure there's no trouble." "I'd like that," she said, and then she was gone, riding toward her cabin with straight-backed confidence that belied the day's events. Jackson watched until she disappeared around the bend, then turned his horse toward home, his mind a tangle of worry, admiration, and something deeper he wasn't quite ready to name. The next weeks brought an uneasy peace. Tommy Peterson recovered fully, and his mother made sure everyone in town knew that Beatrice's remedies had saved him from a serious infection. This tempered some of the more outlandish rumors, but Jackson could feel the undercurrent of tension whenever he went to town. Some folks were friendly as ever, but others, particularly those who attended Reverend Simmons' church or did business with Grant, treated him with cool politeness or outright avoidance. It didn't help matters that he continued to visit Beatrice regularly, often staying until dusk fell over the mountains. They never spoke of how their relationship had changed, but change it had. Jackson found himself thinking of Beatrice at odd moments throughout his day, wondering what she would think of a particular book he was reading, or how she would explain a strange plant he'd noticed while riding the range. He took to bringing her small gifts: an unusual rock formation, a bird's nest fallen from a tree, a bundle of sage tied with twine. In turn, Beatrice began to share more of herself with him. She showed him her father's medical journals, translated passages from her mother's Hungarian recipe books, and taught him the properties of the plants in her garden. Once, as autumn deepened toward winter, she played the violin for him, haunting melodies from her mother's homeland that made his chest ache with a sweet, unnamed longing. It was after one such evening, with the first snow of the season beginning to dust the ground, that Jackson finally acknowledged to himself what he'd been feeling. He loved her intelligence and courage, her quiet compassion and fierce independence. Loved the way she saw the world, not as most people did, but deeper, with an understanding of connections others missed. He hadn't said the words aloud, wasn't sure if he should. Beatrice guarded her freedom carefully, and he wouldn't presume to claim any right to her heart simply because his own had been given so completely. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The fire came in the dead of night, 2 weeks before Christmas. Jackson woke to his ranch hand, young Billy Thornton, pounding on his door. "Boss, boss, wake up. There's a fire over at Miss Evans' place." Jackson was on his feet and pulling on his boots before Billy finished speaking. "Saddle my horse," he ordered, grabbing his coat, "and get the men up. Bring buckets, blankets, anything we can use." The ride to Beatrice's cabin was the longest of Jackson's life, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes at the breakneck pace he set. Even before he crested the final rise, he could see the orange glow against the night sky, smell the acrid stench of burning wood. The cabin was fully engulfed, flames leaping from the roof and pouring from the windows. Jackson's heart stopped, then lurched painfully against his ribs. "Beatrice!" he shouted, scanning the area frantically. "Beatrice!" For one terrible moment there was no answer. Then, from the direction of the small barn where she kept her mare, he heard a weak call. "Here!" She was huddled against the barn wall, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her face streaked with soot. At her feet lay Prometheus, the fox, and a wooden box that appeared to contain her most precious books and papers. Jackson was off his horse and at her side in an instant, gathering her into his arms with a choked sound that was half sob, half prayer. "I thought God, Beatrice, I thought you were inside." She clung to him, trembling violently. "The fox woke me," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "Scratching at the window. I barely got out before the roof collapsed." Jackson looked over her shoulder at the burning cabin, rage building inside him. This was no accident, not in the dead of night, not with how quickly the fire had spread. "Who did this?" he demanded. "I don't know for certain," she said. "But earlier today, 2 men rode by strangers. They didn't stop, just watched the cabin for a while before moving on. I didn't think much of it then." "Grant," Jackson growled. "This has his stink all over it." By now, his ranch hands had arrived and were attempting to contain the fire, though it was clear the cabin couldn't be saved. Billy approached, his young face grim. "Boss, we found something you should see." The boy led them to the other side of the clearing, where a half-empty whiskey bottle lay beside a pile of rags that reeked of kerosene. "Could have been drifters," Billy said doubtfully. "Or hired men," Jackson said. "Either way, this was deliberate." Beatrice stared at the evidence, her face hardening. "They won't drive me out," she said, though her voice wavered. "I won't let them win." Jackson turned to her, taking her cold hands in his. You can't stay here tonight. Come back to the ranch. We'll figure this out together." For once, she didn't argue about needing help. She simply nodded, exhaustion and shock evident in every line of her body. Dawn was breaking by the time they returned to Jackson's ranch house, Beatrice riding double with him, her head resting against his back. He settled her in his bedroom, ignoring her weak protests, and sent Billy to fetch the doctor from town. "I'm not hurt," she insisted as he brought her a cup of strong, sweet coffee. "You breathed in smoke," he countered. "And you're in shock. Just rest." She sank back against the pillows, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "Everything I had was in that cabin," she said quietly. "My father's books, my mother's recipes, all my research notes except what I managed to save in that box. We'll rebuild," Jackson said firmly. "Better than before." She questioned, those sage green eyes fixing on his face. Jackson hesitated only a moment before plunging ahead. "Beatrice, I care for you, more than I've ever cared for anyone. I know you value your independence, and I'd never ask you to give that up. But I want to help you rebuild. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me." She was silent for so long that Jackson began to fear he'd overstepped. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. "When I came to Greeley," she said, "I expected to be alone. I'd accepted that as the price of living on my own terms." Her fingers tightened around his. "But then you found me with that wounded fox, and you looked at me like I was a person worth knowing, not a curiosity or a threat." Her eyes filled with tears. "Do you know how rare that is? To be seen for who you are." "I see you," Jackson said simply. "I've seen you from the first." Beatrice drew a shaky breath. "I care for you too, Jackson, more than I thought possible, but I won't be a conventional wife. I can't give up my work, my studies." "I'd never ask you to," he said fervently. "Your mind is one of the things I love most about you." The word love hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both feeling its weight. "We should get some rest," Beatrice said finally, though she didn't release his hand. "There will be trouble to face in town once word of the fire spreads." Jackson nodded, reluctantly rising. "I'll be in the next room if you need anything." As he reached the door, Beatrice called after him. "Jackson," he turned. "Yes, thank you for believing in me when no one else would." "Always," he promised, and it felt like a vow more binding than any wedding ceremony could provide. The trouble they anticipated came swiftly. By noon, Sheriff Dawson was at the ranch, looking uncomfortable but determined. "There's talk in town about the fire," he said, declining Jackson's offer of coffee. "Grant's saying it was probably an accident, that Miss Evans was conducting some kind of experiment that went wrong." "That's a damn lie, and you know it," Jackson said flatly. "We found kerosene rags and a whiskey bottle. Someone tried to murder her." The sheriff shifted uneasily. "That's a serious accusation, Montgomery." "It's a serious crime," Beatrice said, entering the room. She'd borrowed clothes from Jackson, a shirt that hung loose on her smaller frame and trousers rolled up at the ankles, but she carried herself with the same dignity as always. "Miss Evans," the sheriff acknowledged. "I'm glad to see you're all right." "No thanks to whoever set that fire," she said. "I want it investigated properly, Sheriff. Someone tried to burn me alive in my home." "I'll look into it," Dawson promised, though without much conviction, "but without witnesses." "Convenient, isn't it?" Jackson said. "Setting a fire in the dead of night when no one would be around to see." "What about the men Beatrice saw watching her cabin yesterday?" Billy piped up from where he'd been listening in the doorway. The sheriff frowned. "What men?" Beatrice described them, one tall and thin with a distinctive limp, the other heavyset with a red beard, but admitted she hadn't seen them clearly enough to identify them. "I'll ask around," Dawson said. "But in the meantime—" "Miss Evans, There's some concern in town about your staying here with Mr. Montgomery. Without a chaperone, is that really what you're worried about, Sheriff?" Jackson interrupted incredulously. "Someone just tried to murder her, and you're concerned about proprieties." "It's not me that's concerned," Dawson said defensively. "But Reverend Simmons is already talking about moral corruption, and Grant's suggesting that. Well, that there might be a personal relationship between you two that's clouding your judgment." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Jackson said coldly. "Beatrice stays here where I can ensure her safety. If anyone in town has a problem with that, they can come talk to me directly." The sheriff sighed. "Have it your way, Montgomery, but don't say I didn't warn you." After he left, Beatrice turned to Jackson with worry evident in her eyes. "They'll use this against you, against your business." "Let them try," he said grimly, and try they did. Over the next week, Jackson felt the pressure mounting. Orders for his cattle were mysteriously canceled. Credit at the general store suddenly became unavailable. Reverend Simmons preached a sermon about the dangers of being unequally yoked with unbelievers that everyone knew was aimed at him. But for every setback, there was also support. Mrs. Whitley sent a basket of food and a note expressing her outrage at the fire. The Petersons offered spare clothing for Beatrice. Joe Wilson from the land office stopped by to warn that Grant was looking into technicalities that might invalidate Beatrice's claim on her land. And Jackson's ranch hand stood firmly behind him. When two men from town tried to start trouble at the saloon, suggesting that Jackson was bewitched, Billy and the others made it clear that such talk wasn't welcome. Through it all, Beatrice remained steadfast. She sorted through the few possessions she'd saved from the fire, began making plans to rebuild come spring, and continued her work now from Jackson's dining table, which was soon covered with her papers and the few books she'd managed to save. They settled into an unexpectedly domestic routine. Jackson found he loved coming home to find Beatrice there, loved the discussions they had over dinner, the quiet evenings reading by the fire. They still hadn't defined what they were to each other, but with each passing day, the bond between them deepened. It was 2 days before Christmas when things finally came to a head. Jackson returned from town to find Beatrice standing on the porch, her face pale with anger and hurt. "What happened?" he asked, dismounting quickly. She handed him a letter. "This came while you were gone. It's from a medical college in San Francisco. I'd written to them months ago about a position." Jackson scanned the letter, his stomach sinking as he read. The college had initially been interested in Beatrice's research, but upon further inquiry into her character and circumstances, they had determined she would not be a suitable addition to their faculty. "Grant," Jackson said, the paper crumpling in his fist. "Or the Reverend. They must have written to the college." "It doesn't matter who," Beatrice said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "The result is the same. They're systematically destroying any chance I have of continuing my work. First my home, now my professional prospects." "We'll find another way," Jackson began, but she cut him off. "There is no other way, don't you see? They won't stop until I'm gone from Greeley or broken into submission." She paced the porch, her movements sharp with frustration. "Perhaps I should leave, start over somewhere else." The thought of her leaving struck Jackson like a physical blow. "Is that what you want?" She stopped pacing, her back to him. "Of course it's not what I want," she said so quietly he barely heard her. "But I won't be the cause of your ruin, Jackson. These people are your neighbors, your business associates. Without them, your ranch won't survive." Jackson came up behind her, gently turning her to face him. "Let me worry about my ranch. What I can't survive is losing you." "You barely know me," she protested weakly. "I know everything that matters," he said. "I know you're brilliant and brave. I know you heal instead of harm. I know you see the world with clearer eyes than anyone I've ever met." He took a deep breath. "And I know I love you. I've known it for months." Beatrice's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "Jackson, you don't have to say anything," he hurried on. "I'm not asking for promises, but please don't leave. Not because of Grant or the Reverend or anyone else who's too small-minded to see what I see when I look at you." She reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. "And what do you see?" "The woman I want to spend my life with," he said simply. However unconventional that life might be. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, searching his face as if trying to read the truth in his eyes. Then slowly, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss so achingly tender it nearly brought him to his knees. "I love you too," she whispered against his mouth. "God help me, but I do." Jackson gathered her close, burying his face in her hair. "Then stay. Stay and fight with me. We'll face them together." They stood there on the porch as twilight deepened around them, holding each other as if against a storm. And in that moment, Jackson knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, they would weather it side by side. The next morning, Jackson rode into town with grim determination and a plan. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a series of messages to contacts in Denver, Chicago, and Boston. Next, he visited Joe Wilson at the land office, spending nearly an hour in close conversation with the clerk. Finally, he stopped at the newspaper office, where he spoke at length with the editor, Franklin Pierce. As he was leaving the newspaper, he almost collided with Elias Grant and Reverend Simmons, who were deep in conversation outside the bank. "Montgomery," Grant acknowledged coldly. "I'm surprised to see you in town. Thought you might be too busy with your house guest." Jackson smiled thinly. "Actually, I've been taking care of some business. Legal matters primarily." Something in his tone made both men look sharply at him. "What sort of legal matters?" Reverend Simmons asked. "Oh, just ensuring that Miss Evans' property rights are properly documented and protected," Jackson said casually. "And filing a formal complaint about the arson at her cabin. The territorial governor takes a dim view of attempted murder, I find." Grant's face darkened. "No one's been murdered." "Not for lack of trying," Jackson replied. "By the way, where were your stable hands, Cooper and Denton, the night of the fire? The ones who matched the description of the men seen watching Beatrice's cabin that day." A flash of uncertainty crossed Grant's face before he mastered it. "My employees' whereabouts are none of your concern." "They will be the marshal's concern, though," Jackson said. "I've requested a federal investigation, given Sheriff Dawson's reluctance to pursue the matter properly." "You're making a grave mistake," Reverend Simmons said ominously. "Aligning yourself with that woman against your own community." "The mistake," Jackson said, his voice hardening, "was thinking you could drive an innocent woman from her home and face no consequences. The mistake was believing that everyone in Greeley shares your prejudice and greed." "Careful, Montgomery," Grant warned. "You're treading close to slander." Jackson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not slander if it's true, and I have evidence, Grant. Evidence of your men's involvement in the fire. Evidence of your attempts to manipulate land records. Even evidence of certain financial irregularities at your bank that I'm sure your investors would be interested to learn about." Grant's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Jackson smiled coldly. "I guess we'll find out when the marshal arrives. Should be here day after tomorrow." He tipped his hat. "Gentlemen." As he walked away, Jackson could feel their stares burning into his back. He'd taken a risk, confronting them so openly. But sometimes, he reflected, the best defense was a bold offense, and he would defend Beatrice with everything he had. The next 2 days were tense. Jackson doubled the guards at the ranch, unwilling to take any chances with Beatrice's safety. She, in turn, continued her work with renewed purpose, corresponding with scientists in San Francisco and New York who had expressed interest in her research before the incident with the medical college. "If I can publish my findings," she told Jackson as they sat by the fire on Christmas Eve, "it will establish my credibility regardless of what Grant or the Reverend say about me." "You'll publish them," he assured her, "and more besides." She smiled at him, the firelight casting a golden glow on her face. "You have such faith in me." "Always have," he said, taking her hand. "Always will." They spent a quiet Christmas day together, exchanging simple gifts: a new journal for Beatrice, a book on native plants for Jackson, and sharing a meal with the ranch hands. It was unlike any Christmas Jackson had known, yet somehow perfect in its simplicity and warmth. The following day, the marshal arrived from Denver, a weather-beaten man named Harrington with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully to their account of the fire and the events leading up to it, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions. "I'll need to speak with Sheriff Dawson," he said when they'd finished, "and these ranch hands of Grant's that you mentioned." "Be careful," Jackson warned. "Grant has a lot of influence in town." Marshal Harrington snorted. "Son, I've been dealing with men like Grant for 30 years. Their influence usually extends right up until someone calls their bluff." He stood, gathering his papers. "Sit tight. I'll be back after I've done some digging." True to his word, the marshal returned 3 days later, his expression grim but satisfied. "Got a confession from one of Grant's men," he announced without preamble. "Fellow named Cooper, singing like a canary now that he's facing a federal charge." Beatrice sank into a chair, her hand at her throat. "He admitted to setting the fire, he and Denton both," Harrington confirmed. "On Grant's orders, though Grant was careful not to say exactly what he wanted done. Just told them to convince Miss Evans that her continued presence in Greeley was problematic." "And Grant," Jackson asked, "denies everything, of course." "But Cooper's testimony, combined with some interesting discrepancies I found in the bank's records, has him sweating." The marshal's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "And it seems the good Reverend has suddenly recalled an urgent mission calling him to Denver." "Coward," Jackson muttered. "Most bullies are," Harrington agreed. "Now, Miss Evans, I'll need you to come to town tomorrow to give a formal statement. After that, these men will be transported to Denver to stand trial." After the marshal left, Beatrice and Jackson sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "It's really over?" she finally asked, as if afraid to believe it. "Not entirely," Jackson cautioned. "There will still be those in town who believe the worst about you, but with Grant discredited and the Reverend gone." He reached for her hand. "Yes, I think the worst is over." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but relief. "I can rebuild my cabin, continue my work." "You can," Jackson agreed, though something in his tone made her look at him questioningly. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. Jackson took a deep breath. "Or you could stay here." "With me, permanently." She went very still. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, the words rushing out now. "Not because you need my protection or because of what people might say, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you." He squeezed her hand. "We could add a study to the house for your work, convert the old bunkhouse into a laboratory. Your land would still be yours. We could even build a new cabin there for when you need time to yourself." Beatrice laughed softly. "You've thought this through." "I have," he admitted. "Been thinking about it since before the fire, truth be told." She rose from her chair, coming to stand before him. And you truly wouldn't mind being married to a woman the town calls mad? Jackson stood, drawing her into his arms. Beatrice Evans, I'd be honored to be married to the sanest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. And anyone who can't see what I see isn't worth worrying about. She searched his face, those sage green eyes serious. It won't be easy. Even with Grant discredited, there will be talk. Let them talk, he said simply. All that matters is us. Slowly, Beatrice smiled, a smile so radiant it took his breath away. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you, Jackson Montgomery. The wedding took place in the spring, after the snow melted and the first wildflowers began to bloom on the mountainsides. It was a small ceremony, held on Jackson's now their ranch, with only close friends in attendance. Mrs. Whitley baked the cake. The Petersons brought a quilt as a wedding gift. Joe Wilson from the land office stood as witness. Beatrice wore a simple dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him, her face alight with a joy that matched his own. The new minister, a younger, more open-minded man who had replaced Reverend Simmons, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Beatrice with a tenderness that belied the depth of his feelings, aware that their guests were watching but unable to hold back. Mrs. Montgomery, he murmured against her lips. Dr. Evans Montgomery, she corrected with a smile. I've decided to use both names professionally. Jackson laughed. Of course you have. The reception was simple but joyous. More townsfolk arrived than they had expected, some out of curiosity, others with genuine well-wishes. With Grant awaiting trial and the Reverend gone, the tide of public opinion had begun to shift. Beatrice's successful treatment of the influenza that had swept through town that winter had done much to rehabilitate her reputation. As twilight fell, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. They stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Happy? Jackson asked, his arm around her waist. Happier than I ever thought possible, Beatrice admitted, leaning against him. A year ago, I was alone in that cabin, expecting to live out my life in solitude. Now you're stuck with me, he finished, pressing a kiss to her temple. A fair trade, she teased. Especially since construction on my laboratory begins next week. Jackson laughed. Always practical, my wife. One of us has to be, she replied, turning in his arms to face him. Jackson, I want you to know something. I may never be a conventional wife. There will be times when my work consumes me, when I'm distracted or difficult. I wouldn't want you any other way, he said sincerely. But I will always love you, she continued, her eyes holding his. You saw me when no one else would look. You believed in me when everyone called me mad. You gave me a home when mine was destroyed. Her voice caught. How could I not love you for that? Jackson drew her close, overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings for this extraordinary woman. We'll build something new together, he promised, something neither of us could create alone. Yes, she whispered against his lips, we will. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, no longer the town oddity and her unlikely defender, but simply a man and woman who had found in each other the rarest of gifts, complete acceptance, unwavering support, and a love strong enough to withstand the judgment of those too small-minded to understand it. In time, Greeley would come to see what Jackson had recognized from the beginning, that Beatrice Evans Montgomery wasn't mad but merely ahead of her time. Her remedies would gain recognition beyond Colorado. Her scientific articles would be published in respected journals. The laboratory Jackson built for her would become a place where young women interested in science could come to study, free from the prejudices that had nearly driven Beatrice away. And through it all, through successes and setbacks, through the children they would eventually welcome and the challenges they would face together. Jackson would remain steadfast in his conviction that falling in love with the woman the town had called mad was the sanest decision he had ever made.